我现在在那个纽约市皇后区法院，我们今天在这边要看那个华裔医生程志的一个审判，然后看一下这边已经有很多媒体守在这边。现在 DA 都来了，这个大案。好，这个案件是关于下药性侵多名女子的这个皇后区的一个华裔医生程志的一个庭审。本来以为今天是宣判，其实不是哈，他今天只是一个认罪过程。那对他具体的宣判应该是到8月28日，他就是应该面临24年的监禁，因为我们看到就是戴着口罩的这个华裔男子，他对多名女性在他自己的住所跟医院里面对人家下药，然后在别人处于昏迷的状态性侵别人，而且录下了视频。所以他最后所有的证据都来自于他自己把所有作案的过程都录下来了。然后这个人呢，他就是你看很年轻有为哦，才35岁。然后那个刚才就是最前面我们看到走出来，最开始走出来那个皇后区检察官凯兹他就说了，这个程志他作为医生，他本来应该救人，但是他利用他的身份跟他的那个专业知识，连续2年对那个熟人就认识的一些女朋友或者女性朋友以及医院的患者实施令人发指的这种性犯罪。然后后来有多名受害者勇敢地站出来协助破了这个案件。这个程志他是住在皇后区的 Astoria， 他犯案前他是在那个纽约长老会皇后区的医院里面担任肠胃科的医生。他自己已经认罪了就在今天的这个庭审里面，他承认他在2020年到2022年期间，他在自己的那个公寓内和医院里面对至少4名女性熟人以及4名女性病患实施性侵，然后他还对其中的一项性虐待指控呢，他提出一个叫做阿尔法德认罪。这是一个就是法律上的一个名词这个阿尔法德认罪呢，意思就是说他不承认他就犯罪这件事实，但是呢他承认检方因为证据充足对他的定罪，就不承认我犯了罪，但是我承认我被定的罪。就这个说法大概就是应该是从精神疾病方面的这种来做一个这种逃避吧，一种逃避的这种解释。然后从他2022年被捕以后，一直是没有让他保释的，因为这种人潜逃的几率比较大，因为这是非常高智商的一个罪犯然后纽约州已经停了他的行医执照，估计他24年判下来也不会再拿回来这个行医执照了吧。他的这个案件是在22年的12月27号的时候，然后一个女性在她家的公寓里面，在她的电脑里面看到她自己跟其他女生被性侵的视频之后呢，这个女生就报警了，然后检方就开始展开调查，最后警方就在她家中搜出大量的那种储存的设备，然后这个就是很多画面发现她对多名处于从画面里面能够看到这个女性是处于昏迷状态，然后他对这些昏迷中的这些女生进行这个性侵的这些视频然后一部分的这些受害者是医院的患者，因为他拍视频的那个环境应该就是在医院里面。然后在他家里面呢，还查获到大量的那种芬太尼K 粉可卡因LSD 摇头丸各种医疗用的那些麻醉用药然后2023年8月的时候，他就被控50项罪名。 然后2024年3月的时候呢，又有更多的受害者站出来，然后检方就追加起诉，差不多快60项罪名了。然后其中就是包括从2021年3月到2022年5月期间，有4名的女性受害者在医院在接受检查的时候被他就是下药性侵，这个是很恶劣的哈。你就是去医院好好的去检查身体，最后就发生这些非常恶劣的这种情节。然后另外还有很多在网络上认识他的一些女生，然后也是被他邀请到他的公寓里面，然后给别人下药，然后性侵。可是这些受害者就是事发的经过他们完全不记得，事后也完全不记得，直到警方查获了这些视频以后，联络上他们以后，他们才知道发生了这些事情。因为就是视频里面那些昏迷的女性，就在他们就身旁附近会有一些麻醉的那些棕色的药品。所以说这个事件是相当的恶劣，可以说是相当恶劣哈。因为这种大家都不理解，他作为一个年轻有为的医生哈，长得我们看到现在看他戴着口罩哈，他取下口罩，长得也是很英俊的一个年轻有为的一个年轻人吧，应该讲就是。
When you are released from prison, you will be required to register under the Sex Offender Registration Act, knowing that you still want to plead guilty. With respect to what you're pleading, I'm going to come back to count 1 since it's an Alford plea. So we're going to start with sex abuse in the first degree under count 5 of the indictment. Did you on or about and between June 20th, 2021 and June 21, 2025 in the County of Queens, subject a person known as R.A., an individual known to the grand jury who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless to sexual conduct? Yes. So just for the record, counsel and Mr. Chang, we are not referring to any of the victims by their name because of the nature of the crimes here. We are only using initials. And you consent to that, counsel?
We consent to that, Your Honor. We've reviewed the initials with their corresponding last names.
And Mr. Chang, you are aware of who the person is, R.A.?
Yes, I am, Your Honor.
And also the date of the indictment includes, is more expanded than the date in this allocution that I did. But you consent to this narrow date, correct, counsel?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So with respect to count 7, sex abuse in the first degree under Penal Law Section 130.65, subsection 2. Did you on or about and between May 4th, 2022 and May 5, 2022 in the County of Queens, subject a person known as letter M.B., an individual known to the grand jury and to you, who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless to sexual contact? Did you do that? Okay, with respect to count 9, did you on or about in between the dates of July 1st, 2021 and July 31st, 2021 in the County of Queens engage in sexual intercourse with an individual H.L. known to the grand jury and to you who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless? With respect to count 20, rape in the first degree, did you on or about in between March 24th, 2022 and May 5, 2022 in the County of Queens engage in sexual intercourse with a person with the initials of P.H., an individual known to the grand jury and to you who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically B to sexual contact on November 5th, 2021 when she was incapable of consenting due to being physically helpless? Were you working on November 5th, 2021?
Yes.
What was your position and where were you working?
Gastroenterology fellow, New York Western.
Can you hear that?
Yeah, doctor of nephrology.
No.
Doctor of
Gastroenterology.
Oh, gastroenterology.
Do you acknowledge, which you have reviewed, that on November 5th, 2021, you treated a patient whose initials are MB?
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you acknowledge that you are part of the medical team that day which conducted an endoscopy and colonoscopy on her?
Yes, Your Honor.
Have you had an opportunity to review the grand jury testimony of MB and discuss the testimony with your attorney?
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you acknowledge that MB testified that when she awoke from her procedures, you had your fingers inside of her vagina?
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you acknowledge that your conduct with that MB described in the grand jury testimony is almost identical to the conduct you have already admitted to moments ago concerning 3 other women who are patients at New York Presbyterian?
Yes, Your Honor.
You further acknowledge that while you took video recordings of your sexual conduct involving each of the other 3 patients, the prosecution does not possess such a video recording related to your sexual conduct about which MB testified in the grand jury.
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you acknowledge that if this case went to trial, the crimes for which you are engaged, you're charged involving all of these victims would be tried together, and the jury would see the evidence, including the video recordings of your conduct related to the other 3 women from the hospital?
Yes, Your Honor.
So is it true that despite the evidence in this case, you do not acknowledge your guilt as to the crime of sexual abuse in the 1st degree under Penal Law Section 130.65, subsection 2, that you are charged with relating to MB?
Yes, Your Honor.
First, do you have any recollection of the incident MB described in the testimony or MB herself?
No, Your Honor.
On the other hand, do you have recollection as to the other 3 victims from the hospital?
Yes, Your Honor.
Second, can you please explain in your words why, given the evidence of your guilt of the crimes charged involving MB, and taking into account your lack of any independent recollection of this incident, you do not wish to acknowledge your guilt?
It was potentially part of her medical procedure and treatment.
Despite what you told us with respect to that, do you still wish to enter a plea of guilty to count 1 of the indictment, sexual abuse in the 1st degree, under Penal Law Section 130.65, subsection 2?
Yes, Your Honor.
This is because you prefer to enter a guilty plea now instead of risk being convicted at trial of this charge and receiving a more severe sentence than you have been promised now.
Yes, Your Honor.
Are you pleading guilty to count 1 of the indictment, sexual abuse in the 1st degree, based upon your own rational and voluntary choice, and after having discussed the strength of the evidence against you specific to this count with your attorney?
Yes, Your Honor.
Here, as part of the negotiated plea, I will sentence you to 2 years in prison with respect to this count, and which will run concurrently with counts 9, 20, 28, 53, count 3, 5, and 7. You understand that?
I understand, Your Honor.
If you are to be convicted at trial, do you understand that you could face up to 7 years of incarceration to be served consecutively to any sentence on any other counts for which you might be convicted?
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you wish to enter a guilty plea with respect to this count to avoid the risk of conviction at trial, to avoid the risk of potentially receiving a longer sentence than the one being offered if you are convicted at trial, and to avoid the risk of potentially having a sentence on this charge run consecutively to other sentences?
Yes, Your Honor.
So you're pleading guilty to sexual abuse in the 1st degree under Penal Law Section 130.65, subsection 2, a class D as in David, violent felony offense under count 1 of the indictment. Do you understand?
I do, Your Honor.
Under that count, it is charged that on or about November 5th, 2021, in the county of Queens, you subjected MB, an individual known to the grand jury who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless, to sexual contact. Do you understand?
I do, Your Honor.
By your plea of guilty, you will stand convicted of the crime and face the same consequences that attach to any conviction of any offense. Do you understand?
Yes, I do, Your Honor.
Okay, so with respect to all of these counts, with respect to counts 9, 20, 28, and 53, how do you plead to the charge of rape in the 1st degree in the county of Queens, guilty or not guilty?
Guilty, Your Honor.
With respect to counts 3, 5, 7, and 1, How do you plead to the charge of sex abuse in the first degree in the county of Queens? Guilty or not guilty? Okay, what did I leave out?
On count 3, you just didn't do any allocution.
Count 3, I missed it?
Yes?
Let's go back. On June 20th, 2021, in the county of Queens, subject XY, an individual known to the grand jury and to you, who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless to sexual contact. So how do you plead to the charge of sex abuse in the first degree with respect to this count, guilty or not guilty? People, do you have any additional questions for this defendant?
Yes, I do know.
Go ahead.
And prior to doing that, I just want to place June 1st of 2021 and June 20th, 2021. You were employed at New York Presbyterian Queens Hospital in Queens County, New York, correct?
Yes.
And your position there was you were a gastroenterologist, correct?
Gastroenterology fellow.
Do you admit that on or about in between June 1st to June 20th of 2021, you entered the hospital room of an unconscious patient whose initials were XZ?
Yes.
Do you admit that you entered her room with a cell phone and that once inside you touched her vagina with your hand and recorded yourself doing this with your cell phone?
Yes.
Do you admit that when you touched this unconscious patient's vagina with your hand and recorded your actions, you did not do so for any valid medical purpose and you did so for your own sexual gratification?
Yes.
In sum, do you admit that on or about in between June 1st, 2021 and June 20th, 2021 in the County of Queens, you subjected XZ, who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless, to sexual contact?
Yes.
Next is to count 5. Between June 20th, 2021 and June 21st, 2021, you were employed at New York Presbyterian Queens Hospital in Queens County, New York, correct?
Yes.
And you had the same position, gastroenterology fellow, correct?
Correct.
Do you admit that on or about and between those dates, June 20th to June 21st, 2021, the room of an unconscious patient whose initials are RA?
Yes.
Do you admit that on that date you had performed a gastroenterology consultation for this patient?
Yes.
Do you admit that you entered RA's room with a cell phone and that once inside you touched her vagina and breast with your hand and recorded yourself doing this with your cell phone?
Yes.
Do you admit that when you touched this unconscious patient's vagina and breast with your hand and recorded your actions, you did not do so for any valid medical purpose and you did so for your own sexual gratification?
Yes.
In sum, do you admit that on or about in between June 20th, 2021 and June 21st, 2021 in the County of Queens, you subjected RA, who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless, to sexual contact?
Yes.
Next is to count 7. Between May 4th, 2022 and May 5th, 2022, were you employed at New York Presbyterian Queens Hospital in Queens County, New York?
Yes.
Was your position at that time still gastroenterology fellow?
Correct.
Do you admit that on or about in between May 4th to May 5th of 2022, you entered the hospital room of an unconscious patient whose initials were MB?
Yes.
Do you admit that you were a member of MB's treatment team at the hospital at that time?
Yes.
Do you admit that you entered MB's room with a cell phone and that once inside, you touched her vagina and breast with your hand and recorded yourself doing this with your cell phone?
Yes.
Do you admit that when you touched this unconscious patient's vagina and breast with your hand and recorded your actions, you did not do so for any medical purpose and you did so for your own sexual gratification?
Yes.
In sum, do you admit that on or about in between May 4th, 2022 and May 5th, 2022 in the County of Queens, you subjected MB, who is incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless, to sexual contact?
Yes.
As to count 9, rape in the first degree, do you admit that between July 1st, 2021 and July 31st, 2021, you went on a date with a woman whose initials are HL.
Yes.
Following that date, you and HL went back to your apartment in Queens County, correct?
Correct.
Do you admit that while inside your apartment, HL became unconscious?
Correct.
Do you admit that while she was unconscious, you engaged in sexual intercourse with her?
Yes.
Do you admit that while you were having sexual intercourse with her, you were aware that she was unconscious?
Yes.
Do you admit that you videotaped yourself having sexual intercourse with HL while she was unconscious?
Yes.
In sum, do you admit that on or about in between July 1st, 2021 and July 31st, 2021, in the County of Queens, you engaged in sexual intercourse with HL, who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless?
Yes.
As to count 20, rape in the first degree, do you admit that on or about in between March 24th, 2022 and May 5th, 2022, you went on a date with a woman whose initials were PH?
Yes.
Do you admit that you and PH went back to your apartment in Queens County on one of those dates?
Yes.
Do you admit that while she was in your apartment, PH became unconscious?
Yes.
Do you admit that while she was unconscious, you engaged in sexual intercourse with her, and at the time you engaged in sexual intercourse with her, you were aware that she was unconscious?
Yes.
Further, do you admit that you videotaped yourself having sexual intercourse with PH while she was unconscious?
Yes.
In sum, do you admit that on or about in between March 24th, 2022 and May 5th, 2022, in the County of Queens, you engaged in sexual intercourse with PH, who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless?
Yes.
Next, count 28. Rape in the first degree. Do you admit that on or about in between March 1st, 2022 and May 1st, 2022, you were in a relationship with a woman whose initials were CL?
Yes.
Do you admit that on or about in between those dates, CL stayed overnight in your bedroom and at times in your apartment in Queens County?
Yes.
Do you admit that on at least one occasion while in your bedroom, she became unconscious?
Yes.
Do you admit that on that occasion, while she was unconscious, you engaged in sexual intercourse with her, and that you were aware that she was unconscious while you were engaging in sexual intercourse with her?
Yes.
Do you further admit that on that date and time and place, you videotaped yourself having sexual intercourse with CL while she was unconscious?
Yes.
In sum, do you admit that on or about in between March 1st, 2022 and May 1st, 2022, in the County of Queens, you engaged in sexual intercourse with CL, who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless?
Yes.
Rape in the, as to count 53, rape in the first degree. Do you admit that between September 15th, 2022 and September 17th, 2022, you were dating a woman whose initials were YJ?
Yes.
Do you admit that during that time period, YJ visited your apartment in Queens County and at times stayed in your bedroom within that apartment?
Yes.
Isn't it true that on at least one occasion during those dates, while she was in your bedroom, she became unconscious?
Yes.
Do you admit that on or about in between September 15th and September 17th, 2022, while she was in your Queens apartment and in an unconscious state, that you engaged in sexual intercourse with her?
Yes.
Do you admit that when you did so, you were aware that YJ was unconscious?
Yes.
Do you admit that you videotaped yourself having sexual intercourse with her while she was unconscious in your apartment between those dates?
Yes.
In sum, do you admit that on or about in between September 15th and September 17th, 2022, in the County of Queens, you engaged in sexual intercourse with YJ, who was incapable of consent by reason of being physically helpless?
Yes.
And then finally, just one question as to count 1, which was the outwardly sexual abuse in the first degree. You stated that your reason for not admitting guilt as to that charge was you do not have an independent recollection of that person or incident, and also that it was potentially part of the medical procedure. Do you understand that that could be a potential defense to these charges, and by pleading guilty to these charges, you are giving up that defense?
Yes, I understand.
Nothing further from the people.
Okay, I find the defendant has no waiver is required.
I
And
don't
you,
think-
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
And then, Your Honor, the people are just handing.
okay, what do you have ready?
OK， 我现在已经从那个皇后区法院走出来。今天这个案子呢非常复杂，里面这个程志犯的罪行基本上花了半个小时才读完。